Hello, my name is Mariana. Welcome to this webinar, Fitting Without Verification, What Can Go Wrong? The presenter today will be Lindsay Jørgensen. Lindsay is Assistant Professor of the University of South Dakota, and she will talk, as I said, about fitting without verification. I will just go through the rules of the webinar. All participants are mute to reduce the background noise. It's possible to ask questions during the session. There is a small question box in your webinar menu bar. You can write the question there, and I will prioritize the questions, and Lindsay will have probably the time to answer one or two of them, perhaps three, but we will get the answers for you after the webinar if we can't go through all of them. If you experience any technical problems or need help, please write to me and I will try to help you through. Lindsay, welcome to the webinar. I will give you the screen now, so you will be able to put your presentation. Let's see if it goes. Yes.
I clicked show my screen.
Here you go.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. There's Gunnar, everyone, if anyone wanted to see my little boy. Okay, so now you should be able to just see the screen. Okay, I'm going to go through 5 possible problems of fitting without verification this morning. There are a lot more than that. So number 1 is returns. So one of the things that has been shown is if you actually verify, your return for credit, or people that are returning hearing aids to get their money back, actually goes down. Some of us that are in a place that people have to pay for their hearing aids, this does reduce your profit margin, and so that's a pretty big deal because obviously that's where you're going to get your money, is in hearing aid sales. However, the other thing is returns for reprogramming. This recent evidence has shown that if you do verify, the number of times people return for reprogramming decreases. Well, this is really good because that's taking up slots that are unnecessary. So if you verify, the number of returns for patients coming in that say I'm having this problem or this problem or this problem actually decrease. What that's suggested is that people who are appropriately verified are more satisfied with their devices and don't feel the need to come back. There is another side to this that people say that it's possible if you verify, especially those of us when we're verifying, we actually are talking to our patients, explaining what we're doing. They have more confidence in you as the practitioner. And if someone has more confidence in you as the practitioner, they are less likely to question it, question the programming that you have them set up as. Now, I want my patients to come in and tell me, oh, I'm having this problem or this problem. But one of the things that we all have to tell our patients, especially the older patients, is this is going to be loud. This is going to sound funny. You haven't heard for many, many years. So one of the things is that they may trust my judgment because I've shown them this is the way the hearing aid should be programmed. Interestingly, there's been some recent evidence to show that in the medical field in general, if patients are more confident in you, they're more likely to follow your orders. And that kind of goes into the medical field, where if you have more confidence in your physician and your physician says take these pills, you're more likely to take those pills on time and appropriately if you trust your physician. And I think that really leads over into audiologists, that if they trust you, they're less likely to return for reprogramming for if they feel that it's wrong because you told them that it's right. However, how do you know that it's right without verification? Number 2 in that same stem is overfitting. You know, I think overfitting is a really big problem, especially if you're not verifying for children. So let's talk a minute about that. Because in children especially is that they have a very small ear canal and compared to an adult. So if you're putting a certain amount of sound into their ears, it can really, really get very loud very quickly because of that size of the space. You know, you may be fitting in the hearing aid software saying that you have it as a pediatric patient, but that software doesn't know actually how large that space is. And if you remember back to when you learned about sound pressure level, the smaller the space, the louder the gain. And so too much gain, you have a risk of pain. You also have a risk of making their hearing loss worse. Remember though, we tell them that it's going to be loud. And so, you know, you may have this where the patients are saying, well, yeah, it's loud, but she told me it was going to be loud. But actually it may be too loud and you may be hurting them. And this is really something where we could actually be causing more harm with our hearing aids than we think. You know, I think that when you're talking about patients in general, most patients, they're probably average, or they're probably about, you know, especially some of those older men have larger than average ear canals, which we'll talk about next. But especially your women, your teenagers, your young adults, and your kids are going to have smaller than normal ear canals. I just finished a study, and I just wrote it up and sent it in for publication, that showed if you're actually measuring what's called the RECD, and that's one of the things that I do recommend that you measure, the real ear to coupler difference, you on average, or if you use the average, you're going to be accurate about 80% of the time. So if you use average, you're probably going to be okay. In the adult population, not the pediatric population, in the adult population, you're going to be okay 80% of the time. But it's that 20% of the time that you're not going to be okay. And you have a really significant risk of making their hearing loss worse, especially if you're not verifying. And I will say that also I do run RECD on all of my patients because I'm not okay with being wrong 20% of the time. 3, underfit. So remember that our patients are paying, or a third-party payer is paying for all of these sounds. Too little gain means that they're going to have significantly reduced audibility. Audibility meaning things are not loud enough, that things are, you know, where we're really concerned. This is the one that I want to spend the most amount of time on, because in reality, most manufacturers are going to underfit. If you just click first fit, there's a lot of literature to show that you're going to underfit. And that's because manufacturers are assuming that 60% of audiologists, that's here in the United States, an article that's been about 6 years old, which was the second edition of that article by Mueller and Purkew, showed that 60% of audiologists do not verify. And when you actually look at manufacturers' prescribed gain, most of them are going to be underfit. And that's a really big problem, because remember that the whole purpose of the patients coming to us is reduced audibility. Now, most people have a high-frequency hearing loss, and so you may be hitting those gains in the low frequencies, but in the high frequencies, you may not. And the high frequencies, it's a big problem because that's where our clarity, at least in English, is coming from. The other thing is that with the second part of this is with frequency lowering. One of the things that the hearing aid is supposed to do is move those high frequency sounds into a lower frequency region. Now, depending on what manufacturer you're using, it may be doing frequency transposition, it may be doing nonlinear frequency compression, it may be doing frequency compression, it may be doing some spectral shaping or spectral movement, also sometimes called ghosting. But no matter what it's supposed to be doing is taking those high frequency sounds and moving them into a lower area. One of the things that I'm going to point out at the end is if you order a hearing aid for a specific feature, or if you have a feature enabled, you should probably verify that. And so in this, with too little gain of reduced audibility, I do want to talk about frequency lowering, because one of the things is that we activate this frequency lowering, or some manufacturers actually automatically activate it, but if you don't verify it, then you don't really know what's going on. So there are ways to verify it. one of the things that you can do is actually do the SH sound, the sh and the s, the S sound, to actually look at what's moving and actually making sure that those sounds are audible. The other thing that you want to make sure is that those sounds are different in the spectral weighting, and so that they don't overlap too much. Or if you're in a different language, high frequency sounds that are contrasting. Mariana, do you know of another set of high frequency sounds that are contrasting?
Oh,
It's okay if not.
I have to think about it.
Yeah, have to think about it. I know that there are a lot of many other people that are listening from a variety of languages. So in English, a common one is the S and the SH.
Yes.
And sh. And if they overlap too much, people can't tell. So one of the other things that I want to point out about with this reduced audibility is that with a reduction in audibility, you have a reduction in the person's ability to hear it, but especially if this is a child, they are not going to be able to learn how to produce a sound if they can't hear it. And so I would say that one of the biggest things that is unethically done is not verifying in children. And you heard me say that in the last one, that we may be over-amplifying them. On the other hand, if you go into many hearing aid company software and you choose pediatrics, you may actually be underfitting them. And this is a big travesty. You know, one of the things is parents are really coming to you knowing that their child has a hearing loss, and they're expecting that we're going to do the best by their children and that we're really going to help them. You know, maybe one of their goals is for their child to be able to orally communicate. I really think that that's something that's pretty astounding, that they trust us with their child's ability to communicate. There's recently a video that's out here in the United States. Now, it is a political ad, but I'm not going to go into it as a political ad, but it shows a mom and how she really has a daughter who was born with hearing impairment, and they accessed those services early, and they got hearing aids on her, and then she eventually got a cochlear implant. But one of the things I really like about that ad is it's not just the magic moment of turning on the cochlear implant. What this ad really shows is the amount of work that it takes to get a child to orally communicate. If you're interested in watching it, it is a Hillary Clinton ad. But it's really showing that the parents are really trusting the audiologist and the audiologist's ability as well, and that it is a rehabilitative process. How can we go through that rehabilitative process, though, without ensuring that the audibility is there? And making sure that those hearing aids are providing enough gain. So that's why I said I really want to spend my most amount of time talking about reduced audibility, because if we aren't ensuring that these patients have appropriate audibility, I would say that that's incredibly unethical. Interestingly, I took a RIC hearing aid recently and plugged it into the software, and I was showing the students, and I actually clipped the receiver. Like, I cut it in half and took the receiver off, and the computer said it was still functioning. And what I was trying to say to the students is that this hearing aid, with no receiver attached, the wires were just dangling, the computer is saying that this hearing aid is functioning, but what can you tell me? Well, there's no receiver, so there's no sound coming out. Now, that's a pretty extreme case, but without verification, you don't actually know what's coming out the other end. So, on a side note, though, don't be a slave to the target. So I want to talk about this for a second, because if the black line here are your targets, and you were really pushing the hearing aid, saying, I really want to get this hearing aid to hit these targets, you know, Lindsay and Mariana says we need to hit these targets, but then you look at the red line, and that's the person's threshold. You can see that, especially, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in these high frequencies here, in the high frequencies would be inaudible. So I really want you to have to think through, what are you actually doing? So through this frequency here, the sounds would be audible. So I would want to make sure that I push that device to really hit threshold, to hit targets through this threshold at least, and a little bit into here, but remembering that these, although the targets, are probably going to be inaudible. And remember to look at that entire range as well. So remember, when you run this, you're going to get a range around this center black line. that's going to show you the speech spectrum that's around this. Remember, this is your long-term average speech spectrum, or your LTAS, and around here. So don't be a slave to the target. Additionally, remember that one of the things that Otometrics software gives you is the SII. The SII is that speech intelligibility index, and that speech intelligibility index is going to tell you the percentage of the, at least English, speech sounds that are audible. Now you can take that and know, like for example, that Portuguese has more low frequency sounds, which I learned last time, and so you know, you can kind of take it with a grain of salt if you're using a different language. But the SII is a good way to judge what percentage of your speech sounds are audible. Remember that we're testing in quiet, not noise, and so in quiet things are going to be more easily audible than in noise. Remembering that adults who have a knowledge of the language need only about 40% of the speech sounds to be audible to be able to be heard. But remember, once again, outside of your office, it's going to be noisy, and so that's going to overlap some of those and bring down that SII. So and then with children, remember, children will need to have as much or close to 100 as you can, because children need a better signal-to-noise ratio than adults, and so they're going to get have more interaction of noise, so they need to have more of those speech sounds. Also, they're learning speech, and so they need more of those speech sounds. So don't be a slave to the target, and I think that targets are really important, but also keep in mind what is audible, and do take a look at that SII. I think that SII can really drive some of your fittings. Number 4, directional microphones. So this is actually a very easy test to do. You can do it either on the person, or I typically do it actually when the hearing aids come in after I've ordered them, or we have our technician do them. My technicians are my students, but you can have your technician run this, and it's very, very easy to run. All you do is you force that hearing aid into directional microphone setting. You put it in the box. You run it on a front, and then you run the setting, and then you turn that hearing aid around to 180 degrees or 90 degrees, depending on what polar plot your manufacturer is using. That's something else you should pay attention to. And if you run it again, what you should see is that intensity drop. What that tells you is that the microphones are placed in the appropriate orientation. What I mean by that is the front microphone is actually the front, and the back microphone is actually the back. So I would ask you guys, what is your reversal rate? And if you don't have a reversal rate, or you tell me that none of your hearing aids are reversed, I would say that you've probably never run this. I would say that our reversal rate is getting better, but we still have about 5% of our hearing aids that come to us or even come back from repair with those microphones reversed. Some manufacturers are better than others, but do keep that in mind. Additionally, keep in mind if you're using a repair company that is outside of the company that you are using, or that is the hearing aid. Let me give you an example. Some manufacturers will not repair a hearing aid if they're over a certain age, so you send them to an all-make. There are many all-make repair companies, remembering that some all-make repair companies are better than others. Additionally, keeping in mind if you're using an all-make repair company, ask them what type of microphone and what type of receiver they're using. There are some all-make repair companies that are using very inferior products. So the company that you're sending that hearing aid to, you may actually be getting a hearing aid that's worse coming back than the one that you sent them. This happened to us recently, so that's why I'm talking about it briefly, where we had someone who had gone to another place and they had sent it to an inferior all-make repair. I then sent it to a much better all-make repair company, and the hearing aid came back with a MEMS microphone and a high-quality receiver. MEMS microphones are kind of your new silicone microphones. Problem number 5. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing. The reversal rate, I think you have to explain what reversal is, because I don't think everybody knows that.
So when I talk about what your reversal rate is what is your percentage of your hearing aids that come to you with those front and back microphones reversed. I apologize. And I would say that when I have about a 5% of my hearing aids that come into my office, that the front and back microphones are reversed. This is one of the reasons that I check the hearing aids before the patient arrives, preferably a couple days before the patient arrives, because then I can send that hearing aid back to the manufacturer and say these hearing aids the microphones are flipped. Or maybe even not working. I will tell you that also, depending on what manufacturer you're using, I would highly recommend, instead of depending upon the automatic switching into directional microphones, that you actually force that hearing aid into directional microphones, because it won't work very well if you just run a front and then back measurements. Thank you, Mariana. I apologize for that.
It's okay.
All right, so number 5 that I want to talk about is, what is the problem? So this comes to patients coming into your office with a hearing aid problem. So one of the things that I always do is I say, is it the patient or is it the hearing aid? And I think that this is something that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because if a patient comes in and says to you, my hearing aid's not working, is it the hearing aid? Or is it that the patient's hearing has decreased? And one of the ways that I do this is I run an ANSI curve after I do the hearing aid fitting. So the day of the fitting, I actually run an ANSI curve and I keep it in the chart. Remember, an ANSI curve is going to run an OSPL 90, but it's also going to run a 65 dB frequency curve. It's also going to run your equivalent input noise and your distortion as well, but I really look at it from that 65 dB input. And it just gives me a basic graph. I print that and I keep it in a chart. Yes, it's only 65. It's not an entire speech map really or aided response. It's not an entire really or aided response. But what it is that it does keep it gives you an idea of what the frequency response of that hearing aid is at a 65 dB input. So when you're looking at a 65 dB input, that's really easy, because that's actually what most people talk at. So what happens is that the patient comes in and says, my hearing aid's not working well, and you listen to it. And one of the studies that I just finished as well, and just writing up for publication, shows that audiologists are not good at looking at a hearing aid and knowing if it's dirty or not. And that's really interesting, because, I would think, hey, I could look at this hearing aid and know if it's dirty and know if it needs to be cleaned, but actually I don't. And one of the other things is that a patient's reports of difficulty in noise, so I had a patient rate on a scale of 1 to 7, how much difficulty are you having in noise? And the higher rating that they had, or the more difficulty they reported, was directly related to how much debris or how dirty that hearing aid was. So what I want you to do is clean that hearing aid and run an ANSI curve when they come in, and compare it back to the day that you fit those hearing aids. And I think that will show you maybe the hearing aid's not functioning. One of the other things to note is maybe they came in and it was dead, but you got it back up to 50%. You wouldn't know by listening to it that it was only at 50% volume or 70% volume. Our ears are not good at judging exactly how loud a sound is. If you remember back to psychoacoustics, that's one of the things that they talk about, is that our brains and ears are not perfectly calibrated. And so you don't actually know how much sound that person's getting or should be getting. And so if you run another ANSI curve and compare it back to the day that you were fit, then you could know, is it the patient or maybe was it the hearing aid? Now, it's possible that it was both, but one of the things that I can say is, yes, I've cleaned this hearing aid, and yes, it's functioning exactly the same way as the day that I fit it. And I think that that's pretty important. On a side note, I will tell you that there was an article published this month, or maybe last month, in JAAA that showed that hearing aids that are arriving in from our manufacturers are not meeting basic ANSI specifications to what they reported to the Food and Drug Administration, at least, or the TGI or the CE or whatever body that they're reporting to, especially in the equivalent input noise. That's how noisy that hearing aid is without any gain, where that buzz that you hear in the background, they're really loud. Additionally, that they're having quite a bit of distortion, unfortunately. So one of the things that I do is I always run an ANSI curve when they come. before they're programmed to actually look at the equivalent input noise in some of those. So for example, if on your spec sheet it says 19, that's a really common equivalent input noise, and you run it and it's 36, which happens quite often, I've sent that hearing aid back to the manufacturer and said this hearing aid is very, very noisy. So on minimum, I would say do a real ear aided response of a soft, a moderate, and a loud sound, and do a maximum power output, so you're making sure you're not hurting that patient. You want to test directional microphones. Like I said, you can test it before they arrive and run an ANSI curve. Those are kind of on minimum what I do. Testing all the features that you feel are important. For example, if you're ordering a hearing aid because of frequency lowering, I really would recommend that you run it. So your reasons to verify, I would say, are you saves you money. It reduces risks to the patients, both underfitting and overfitting. It also, if your directional microphones are reversed, it's possible that the patient's hearing behind them better than in front of them, and that could be a safety risk. It increases your patient's confidence in you if you're explaining to them what they're doing. And remember that our patients and or third-party payers, like the government or insurance companies, are expecting it and they're paying for it. So we should absolutely verify. And it is 27 after the hour, whatever hour you're on. Does anyone have any questions?
Lindsay, there is one question, actually two. One of them is, how do I know how good the SII value should be, depending on...
Oh, that's a very difficult question. How do you know how good the SII should be? Oh, Mariana and I gave an hour and a half talk on this at AAA last year, and probably going to do it again because, you know, I think that the SII is one of those very difficult concepts. How good should it be really relates back to how much hearing loss they have. You know, I think that if someone with a severe to profound hearing loss, if you can get 40, 50%, that's awesome, especially at a 65 dB input, because 65 is where most people are talking. So if you can get, you know, an SII of 50, 60, that's great. If someone has a pretty mild hearing loss, you should be getting up into the 80s. Remembering that you're never going to get 100% because hearing aids don't go that high out in bandwidth.
Don't you think the DSL table that they did could be something just to give you a value and then an indication of the value that could help people that don't have the experience? Because I think after some time when you have the experience, then you can look at the curve and see, oh, I expect something around 40 or something. But in the beginning, it's for children, but it could give you an indication of what to expect.
That's a really good point. Yeah, Susan Scully and the group out of Canada made a great table for children using DSL. Remembering that when you are looking at that, if you're fitting NAL as your targets, you may be your SII may be a little bit less.
Yes, exactly. The other question is about when you said that you do RCDs for adult as well, because you don't want to be, you said 20% of the time, I'm not sure, I'm making a mistake. But if you do the hearing, if you do the verification, do you still need to do the RCDs?
I would say yes. So RECD has actually very little to do with the actual real ear aided response. And I know this seems funny for me to say that, but what the RECD is doing is converting your dBHL audiogram to dBSPL. So remember when you're running a audiogram, let me give you an example of 1,000 hertz. And let's say I present and the person responds at 60 dBHL, 60. That our hearing aids are in SPL, so that the software has to convert from dBHL to dBSPL. And when it does that, if you use the average, and I'll tell you 1,000 hertz is the only one I know, so what it would do is it will say, oh, that person responded at 60 dBHL, therefore their threshold is 67 dB SPL. And so that may work for 80% of your patients, but for 20% of your patients, it's going to be wrong. And what I mean by that is that I may be putting 60 dB HL into their ear using those insert headphones or headphones, but what actually is hitting their eardrum may be 75 because their eardrum is very, very small. So one of the reasons to do RECD is that it converts your dBHL thresholds accurately to dBSPL thresholds, and then your targets are actually based on your dBSPL targets. And so if you want your targets to be accurate, then you need your conversion to be accurate from dBHL to dBSPL. That accurate conversion, like I said, if you use the average, you're going to be okay with that conversion about 80% of the time. But 20% of the time, you're not going to be accurate. So what I mean, so for some people, your targets are actually going to be too much gain. And for some people, your targets are actually not going to be enough gain if they have a really big ear. I hope that makes things a little clearer, or maybe worse.
No, I don't think so. We don't have any more questions, and we are running out of time. So I want to say thank you, Lindsay, to collaborate with us in this webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
The webinar
have a good
has been recorded, so people will be able to see it later on. And have a good day, everybody.
Have a good day, or morning, or night, or
yeah. Okay.
All right, bye-bye.